member from Etobicoke Centre from the top, please.
Mr. Speaker, it is clear where our government stands on Ukraine. We understand that the Ukrainian people are not only fighting for their own freedom and survival, but they're also fighting for us, and that we need to be fighting for them. It is also clear where Conservative MPs stand. Their leader has never advocated for military, financial, or humanitarian support for Ukraine. They voted against the Canada-Ukraine Free Trade Agreement, and yesterday, the leader of the Conservative Party dismissively referred to Ukraine as a faraway foreign land. Under this leader, the Conservative Party has abandoned Ukraine. Could the Prime Minister please reassure Canadians that this government will stand with the Ukrainian people until they win?
Yvan, it's great to see you this morning.
Thanks for having me, Jason.
Yvan, you're a member of Parliament from Canada, and more than just representing the riding of Etobicoke, you're also in charge of the Canadian-Ukrainian Parliamentary Friendship Organization. What do you see going on in Canada now? Because when I see in Canadian news, I don't see a lot of pro-Ukrainian support, quite the opposite. I see the rise of people like Pierre Poilievre, who are just getting stronger and stronger, and they're very outspoken on the need to stop assisting Ukraine. What's going on?
Yeah. So I think the vast majority of Canadians are strong supporters of Ukraine. That said, Pierre Poilievre, the person you referred to, is the leader of the Conservative Party, the leader of the official opposition, the second largest party in our parliament. And he has, since he's become leader, the Conservative Party has abandoned Ukraine. They voted against, multiple times, against funding for weapons for Ukraine. They voted against Canada's training mission, where we've trained 40,000 Ukrainian soldiers who are now fighting on the front line. They voted against financial support for Ukrainians who fled the war and come to Canada. They voted against the free trade agreement. He's referred to Ukraine as a faraway foreign land, and so on and so forth. So he's taken many actions that are harmful in his voting record and not in his party's voting record against Ukraine. I think what's happening, to be honest with you, is a couple of things. One is that there is a far-right movement in Canada, just like there is in the United States, that has a tremendous amount of influence in the Conservative Party. Mr. Poilievre got elected largely because of the support of this far-right coalition. And this far-right coalition believes pro-Putin propaganda, pro-Kremlin propaganda, and doesn't support Ukraine. So it has a lot of influence in the Conservative Party. I think the second reason is, and Conservative commentators have talked about this, that Mr. Poilievre is seeking to consolidate the vote of the PPC. This is a far-right party in Canada that's always been pro-Putin, pro-Kremlin. And so basically, he is trying to earn the support, pandering to these groups of folks. And as a result, he's voting against Ukraine. I don't think that's reflective of the broader Canadian population, but I think it is worrying because he, I hope this doesn't happen, but he could be prime minister someday. And if he does, that worries me. If he's not supporting Ukraine now, I don't think we can count on him to support Ukraine if he becomes prime minister.
In a lot of countries, there's concerns that Russia is trying to subvert their domestic politics. Do you see signs of that occurring also in Canada, or Russian disinformation playing into the mix of what happens in Canadian political life?
Absolutely. I mean, we've seen it, how it played out in the United States, and I think we've seen Russia use very similar tactics in Canada. You talked about disinformation or misinformation. That's a primary tool that Vladimir Putin has used over the course of many years to misinform people about Ukraine, about his motives, why he was going to invade, why he invaded, etc., to whitewash the war crimes that he's committed, and so on and so forth. And I think we've seen that have a tangible impact in a number of ways. Maybe one of the most significant is what I was mentioning to you a moment ago about how there is a far-right movement in Canada, just like there is in the United States. We've seen in the United States how that far-right movement has influenced some Republican politicians in particular in the United States, and their refusal to support Ukraine when it comes to financial and military aid. And I think a lot of that is driven by that coalition of folks, I think, has been persuaded by pro-Putin propaganda and misinformation that's been out there for years. And I think we have a very similar problem here. That misinformation has been targeted at Canadians. There is a far-right pro-Putin wing of the Conservative Party. And as a result of that, we've seen the tangible impact of that is we've seen the Conservative Party vote consistently recently against support for Ukraine. And so even though the majority of Canadians support Ukraine, polls show that, and the majority of Canadians want Canada to support Ukraine, you've got that misinformation, those actions that the Russian government, that Putin has taken to influence people, taking hold and influencing the voting behavior of certain elected leaders in Canada. And that's really, really worrisome.
When you look at the numbers, Canada says it's going to support Ukraine, and some countries like Estonia is giving 3.5% of its GDP. Denmark's giving 2.4% of its GDP. Canada, it's about 16th place, is giving about 0.32% of its GDP to assist Ukraine. Why is that?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that, look, those countries that you cited, the Baltic countries, Denmark, have done tremendous things, and they've provided tremendous support, and that should be applauded. I think Canada's still a leading country in supporting Ukraine. I think you'd be really proud of what we've done. We just recently, in our last budget, announced almost another $3 billion in aid to Ukraine. That was just last week. Canada's contribution to Ukraine is about $14 billion over the last 2 years. That includes things like we've provided the most financial aid, like direct financial assistance per capita in the world, number one. We've provided about $4 billion in military assistance, hundreds of millions in humanitarian aid. So we've trained over 40,000 Ukrainian soldiers. That's going back to 2015, right? That's not just over the last couple of years. So I think it's important to take all of that into account. And not all of those things that I just spoke about are in those numbers that you talked about, are calculated in those numbers that we talked about. We've just signed a free trade agreement with Ukraine. We're also leading an initiative with Canada, and President Zelensky, the government of Ukraine, are leading an initiative to help identify and try to rescue the Ukrainian children that Russia has kidnapped and taken to Russia, I'm sorry. So we've taken a lot of steps like those. But the other thing I would say to you is we've been a leading country in a number of areas like sanctions on Russia and trying to put economic pressure on Russia, in diplomatic aid. I just mentioned the leadership on the issue of the children, on making sure that Russia's war crimes are prosecuted. We're leading in that regard with a number of other countries. So we're doing a lot of things that I think are really, really important, that don't necessarily show up in that number you cited. But even if you just look at the hard dollars, we've still provided $14 billion in aid to Ukraine, and our government has committed that we will stand with the Ukrainian people until they win, which means that we will stand with them and we will provide the aid that we can until Ukraine achieves that decisive victory. I would also say that it's really important to remember that Canada's contributions are really something that I think we need to know that countries are there in the short run, but also in the long run. And I think that commitment to Ukraine's victory demonstrates that Canada is going to be there in the long run, at least under this government.
Well, Yvan, I'm glad you're taking the lead on this. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you, Jason. Thanks for having me.